many times in one video can I say I had a good time? But I had a good time. Starting with, why is my eye twitching? I also, ooh, she lost her voice. My eye is literally twitching. What is happening? You see that? He's been murdered, his throat has been slit. That doesn't make sense. Is that a good description? Okay. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are here to discuss all of the books that I read in July and August. I got through 12 books in July and 13 books in August. Editing Charlie here. I actually forgot to mention another book that I read in July. I read You Lost a Lot of Blood by Eric LaRocca. So it was actually 13 books in both months. My bad. Okay, back to the video, which is pretty average for me. It's not great by any means, but it wasn't bad. It's pretty on the nose with what I typically am able to do. So I'm not mad at it, but I'm hoping to up those numbers a bit in the fall. So altogether, we're going to be talking about 25 books today. So I'm going to try and keep it short, sweet, give you a brief synopsis and my rating, and move right along. But we all know how long-winded I can be. So here's hoping I can dial that back a little bit. So grab a coffee, get cozy, and let's talk about some books. The interesting thing about July is everything I read, aside from the graphic novel, I gave either a 4 or a 5 star to. So overall, I loved everything I read, like everything, which is a little different than my experience in August, where almost everything I gave a 3 or a 4 to. But we'll get there. So starting in the month of July, these are roughly in order of ratings from, I don't want to say worst because none of them were bad, but from worst to best. First, I have Stalking, which I read during Summerween. I actually didn't rate this because it is not really my cup of tea as far as genres goes. This is a graphic novel, manga situation. It was a really good time, but I just don't think that graphic novels are for me. They're just not up my alley. This follows a boy who has a crush on another guy that goes to his college. He begins subtly stalking him. It's not in a malicious way in any way, but he starts following him around. And while he's stalking him, he discovers that this guy that he has a crush on is actually a murderer. But it was a good time. I had a good time reading it. I think if I were to rate it, it would be roughly around like a 3, just because I can see the merit in it. I just think for me personally, I'm not in that headspace, at least right now. The next books that I read are When in Rome, as well as Practice Makes Perfect by Sarah Adams. These are companion romance novels, and they take place in a small town in Rome, Kentucky. First book follows a pop star who ends up sort of fleeing her life and ending up in Rome, Kentucky, just because she's burnt out and she's tired and she wants to just get away from it all. And she ends up meeting this sweet small town man who sweeps her off her feet. And then the second book is about that small town man's sister and the pop star's Bodyguard. I gave them both 4 stars, although I will say I think that I preferred Practice Makes Perfect to When in Rome. Not by much, but I just think I enjoyed these characters and this story just a little bit better than reading about a pop star trying to get away from her difficult life. But overall, this was definitely a great series, and I look forward to seeing what else Sarah Adams comes out with. I don't know if she's going to write any more in these or something new, but I really enjoyed it, and I would definitely pick up a Sarah Adams again for sure. Next we have A House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher. This is one of her newest novels. It's a horror novel, but it felt very low stakes and almost cozy in a way. It was beautiful writing. It was really well done. I gave this a 4. I read this during Summerween, so if you want to hear more of my thoughts, you can check out that vlog. The same thing goes with Wrong Place, Wrong Time. I also read this during Summerween, and I also gave this 4 stars. I thought this was wonderful. Overall, I thought this was such a unique thriller, and I would highly recommend it to anyone. This came out last year, and it actually won the Goodreads Choice Awards in 2022 for thrillers. So obviously, it's a very well-loved thriller, but if you haven't checked it out yet, I would definitely recommend it. This involved a woman who one night watches her son commit murder in the middle of the street in front of their house, and then she wakes up the next day, and it's actually the day before. So she is continually moving backwards in time, all the while trying to figure out why her son did this, what the situation was, and is it possible to stop it. It was really unique, and I had a great time reading it, and I highly recommend it. Next, we read The Troop by Nick Cutter. This is a horror novel about a Boy Scout troop on a camping trip. They come across this man who is totally emaciated and clearly very ill. I don't want to give too much away because I really do think it's best to go into this pretty blind, but I will say it is incredibly graphic. But if you're into that kind of thing, it was really, really good. The audiobook was great. The whole thing overall, the experience was excellent, and I totally understand why so many people recommend this in the horror genre, and I'm so glad I finally got to it. This one I gave a 4 star again. I loved it. I also read Dead 11 during Summerween. This is, again, a 4 star for me. This follows a woman who is trying to figure out what happened to her son. The only hint or clue that she finds is the words Clifford Island scratched into his floor of his bedroom. So she decides to go to Clifford Island to try and uncover what's going on. And the island is incredibly bizarre. Everybody there thinks that it is the 90s. They're basically living the same day over and over again in the 90s. They're all following these same rules. It feels almost cult-like. It's very odd and very strange. I wouldn't say this is a super twisty book, but I think if you go into it blind, trying to figure out what these people are up to on this island, it does create such a page-turner that I had a great time reading it, even if I didn't find any of the plot developments mind-blowing in any way. I think overall it was so unique and creative, and it was great. I gave it a 4 star. Next, we have The True Love Experiment by Christina Lauren. This is a companion sequel to The Soulmate Equation. I definitely enjoyed this better than The Soulmate Equation. I think mainly that's due to the characters, as well as the audiobook for this was just so good. Both the narrators were so excellent. I read this during a 24-hour reading vlog, so if you want to check that out, you can hear more about my thoughts about this book. But I gave it a 4 star. I had a great time reading it, and Christina Lauren just never really fails me, honestly. Now we are getting into our 5 stars from July. This is All the Sinners Bleed by S.A. Cosby. This was so well done. It is about a small-town sheriff in the South. He is dealing with the aftermath of a school shooting in which the perpetrator ends up getting gunned down by the cops. And there's a lot of racial politics and religion, and it's such a good read. S.A. Cosby is just, he's so good. Seriously, he's one of those authors, I feel like I could recommend him to almost any type of reader, and they would get something out of his books. Razorblade Tears was excellent, and this was maybe even better. I loved this. I loved it. I want to read it again, honestly. Next, we have the new Riley Sager, The Only One Left. This, honestly, was definitely a 5 star for me. I had so much fun. This follows a woman who goes to live and work in this spooky house, taking care of an elderly lady who, back in the day, was accused of killing her entire family. It's very Lizzie Borden-esque. It was so much fun. The twists were, some of them were ridiculous, but like I could not stop reading this, and I had the best time reading it, and I had to give it a 5 star. Next, we have Love Theoretically by Ali Hazelwood. Absolutely my favorite Ali Hazelwood that she's written to date. They are all similar, but these characters in particular did something for me. Specifically, the female character was so incredibly relatable. It felt like I was reading my own relationships, and it felt like this was written based off of my therapy sessions. It was so well done. It does have more of a scientific undertone than the other books. They're all STEM-based books, but this one specifically really dives into some of the politics behind physics and theory versus experimental. I honestly, that part I feel like added to the whole book. I loved this so much, and I think this is probably one of my favorite romances I've read so far this year. It's definitely in the top 5. I had to give this 5-star. Highly recommend. And my favorite book that I read in July was Any Man by Amber Tamblyn. Honestly, it was hard to pick out of the 5 stars because I had 4 of them, and that's very rare for me. But I have to say this was my favorite one. This is such an impactful read. It is so heavy. It is so intense. But oh my God, is it worth it if you can get through some of the graphic depictions of violence and sexual violence. It was so brilliant. I can't even speak highly enough of it. There is some interesting writing within this. Some of it almost feels poetic. Some of it is more prose. It follows these men who all share one thing in common, and that is that they were violently assaulted by a serial rapist. Violently. And it is very descriptive. It is the fallout and how they all handle this. It has so much commentary on sexual violence in general and victim blaming. Honestly, the fact that it was men who were being made victims and not women, I think made it even more powerful. Honestly, we all know that these things happen to women every single day. They don't get the justice they deserve quite often. But reading this about men going through this, it almost felt like, I don't know, like, look, this can happen to men too, and so maybe we should start giving a shit. It just, I don't know. I can't even put it into words because this book is so much smarter than I am, but it was just so good. If you can deal with the graphic depictions in this book, it is so worth the read. I honestly think that colleges should teach this book. For real. Like, I think this is so incredibly, incredibly amazing. I loved it. All right, we have reached August. In August, as I said, I read 13 books, and unlike July, I only had 1 5-star, and the rest were a mix of 3s, 4s, and a 2, which is one of my most disappointing books of the year. So let's start there. I had to give A Twisted Love Story a 2-star. This was one of my most highly anticipated thrillers this year, and I am so disappointed that I didn't love it the way I thought I would. I still love the cover. I still love Samantha Downing, and I will pick up whatever she writes. But I almost feel like this was marketed wrong. It didn't have any thrilling aspects of it. This follows a very toxic relationship between a man and a woman who have been on and again, off again, boyfriend, girlfriends since college. Within their relationship, they're constantly trying to hurt each other and one-up each other. Unfortunately, that results in a lot of people around them getting hurt. It felt like there was no plot. It felt like there was nothing to look forward to, nothing to uncover. Anything that could have been mysterious or twisty was pretty obvious from the start what was happening and what was going to happen. And on top of that, that would have all been fine. I can get on board still if these characters were more fully fleshed out. But they're supposed to be these incredibly toxic people, and yet they're not that bad. Like, yes, they're not good to each other. Yes, they're a little bit messed up in the head, but it could have gone so much further, which would have made it so much more interesting. And I felt like they didn't even really have chemistry. It was hard to buy why they were even together. And the bad things that they did to each other were so surface level that I just kept waiting for something crazy to happen, and nothing ever did. And it ended up being so disappointing. I'm so upset about this. I feel awful giving this a 2-star because I really do love Samantha Downing, but it just did not work for me. I'm so sorry, Samantha. I really am. I'm so sorry. And I'm going to keep picking up all of your books. This just didn't work for me personally. We also read The Boyfriend Candidate by Ashley Winstead. Now, Ashley Winstead writes thrillers that I absolutely love. In My Dreams I Hold a Knife is one of my favorite thrillers of all time. And within that thriller, one of my favorite parts of it was actually the romance, which you don't typically see in a thriller. She has begun to also dabble into romance. She wrote another romance that came out last year, I want to say, called Fool Me Once. And then this is her second romance novel. Both of them have to do with the political world. This follows a man running for the Texas governor's seat and this woman who is a teacher. So these two characters end up getting caught by the paparazzi after a one-night stand. And to protect his image, his campaign team decides to force them into a fake relationship so that it doesn't look like he's sleeping around and having one-night stands and being a playboy. Honestly, this was a very middle-of-the-road romance for me. I can't say that I loved either of the characters, but I think they were both well written. I can't say that I loved the plot or that it was very unique or original, but it was well done for what it was. It's just, it feels very average. It felt like a very average romance. Honestly, it was middle of the road, 3 stars. Similar situation with Rock Bottom Girl. This I read during a 24-hour readathon, which you can feel free to check out if you want more thoughts about this. So we follow this woman named Marley who moves back to her hometown. She's just lost her job as well as her entire savings, which she had put into this startup because she became an investor in it. The company went bankrupt. She lost everything. She's moved back in with her parents and she's trying to figure out what her next steps are and trying to get back on her feet. So she decides to take this temporary position as a PE teacher as well as a girls soccer coach in her old high school. And in this old high school, there is also a man there who is a history teacher, but she used to go to high school with him and they have a bit of a past. They end up deciding to fake date for reasons, I don't know, it's convoluted and spoilery, so I won't get into it. It was definitely fun, but it didn't feel very fresh. One of my biggest issues with this was it took me so long to get invested in these characters. Marley felt very woe is me a lot of the time, a little bit whiny, and not really willing to try and improve her situation in a lot of ways. I ended up loving Jake's character, but it took me a minute to get into it. And one of my biggest issues with Lucy Score in general is the length of her books because, I don't know, me personally, I just don't think romance novels need to be 600 pages. That's just a personal preference. I've yet to read a romance novel that's this long that I felt needed to be this long. I'm glad I read it. It was good, not great. Next we have Done and Dusted. This is a small town romance. A lot of these have a lot in common, my goodness. We follow a woman named Clementine Ryder, which is a bit on the nose, but cute, I suppose. She rides horses professionally, competitively. She's moved out of her hometown and made a big name for herself in the horse riding business, I guess. She ends up having an accident that knocks her from her horse, and it ends up affecting her mentally more so than her physical injuries, to the point where she's afraid to get back on her horse, literally. So she moves back to her family's ranch to try and recover and figure out her next steps, very similar to Rock Bottom Girl. And while she's there, she runs into her brother's best friend, who she's always had a small crush on, but at the same time kind of can't stand him. They end up falling for each other. He ends up trying to help her get back on the horse. It's cute. It's adorable. It can be swoony at times. It was the perfect length for a romance, I will say that. I've read quite a few cowboy romances recently, and maybe that's why I didn't rate this higher, because I was comparing this to a lot of Elsie Silver's books, which I've really enjoyed. So this just felt a little bit underwhelming, but I had a good time reading it, and I definitely would be interested to see what else she comes out with. I am definitely going to pick up the next books in this series. So yeah, 3 star. Next up we have Unfortunately Yours by Tessa Bailey, which is the companion to Secretly Yours. This one, honestly, I'm not going to lie, was a little bit disappointing for me because Tessa Bailey is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, romance author. At least top 5. Honestly, I don't even know who my favorite is, but she's definitely in my top 5. And I've loved almost every single book she's ever written. Like, loved. But Secretly Yours was not really my thing. And I had high hopes that this one was going to work better for me just because of the plot and the characters, but it didn't. This honestly took me like weeks to read, which is how I can tell that something's not working for me, and I probably should have just DNF'd it. I just did not care. I wanted to care so badly, but I did not care. I thought both of the characters were going to be so interesting. They ended up being in like a forced marriage situation, which just sounded so much fun to me. And both of the characters were so interesting, and yet I was so bored, and I just didn't care. And I was so sad about it because I love Tessa Bailey, and for some reason her most recent 2 books just didn't work for me. So I'm looking forward to seeing what she writes next. These all take place at a vineyard, and I don't know, maybe this specific vineyard world and these specific characters just aren't my cup of tea. I don't think that means that I'm not going to like Tessa Bailey anymore. I think it just, these specifically just weren't for me. So I gave it 3 stars. Next we have The Naturals by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. I read this as well during the 24-hour readathon, and I gave this 3.5 stars. This is the first book in the Naturals series. It's about a group of teenagers that goes to work for the FBI to solve cold cases because they all have like a talent for figuring out when people are lying or figuring out the psychology behind certain people and profiling. It's like Criminal Minds, but with teenagers. It was a lot of fun. I think I had really high hopes for it because I've heard so many people just raving about this series recently. So I think I went into it with a little bit too high of expectations. But that being said, I in no way didn't have fun. I loved it, and I'm really interested to read the rest of them because I think overall this series could be a big win for me. This one was just very much an intro to all the characters, and the plot didn't pick up until the very end. So I'm really excited to read the rest of the series. Like I said, I had fun with this, and I have a really good feeling about the next 3 books. Next, we have The Bodyguard by Catherine Center. This I gave a 4 stars. I can't believe how long it took me to read this. I started it probably 4 different times over the last year. Recently, I saw a ton of people reading it on BookTube and giving it super high ratings, and it re-inspired me, re-motivated me to pick it up again. I ended up reading it in basically one sitting. It was so much fun. This follows a famous actor who has been having some stalking threats recently, and so he needs to hire protection. And this woman ends up being hired to be his bodyguard, but he is going home to take care of his mother who's facing cancer. He doesn't want her to worry about him and worry about these threats that he's going through. So he decides to pretend to date her so that they don't know that she's his bodyguard. So it's another fake dating situation. But Catherine Center's characters are so grounded and realistic. It's definitely not as fluffy as some of the other fake dating that I read this month. It definitely has a more serious undertone, and there's some really serious topics discussed. It just flew by. It was really, really fun. I really enjoyed it. Next, we have Dark Corners by Megan Golden. This is sort of a companion to The Night Swim. This follows the same podcaster from The Night Swim. She gets called to a prison to meet with a prisoner who's actually about to get out of jail. This prisoner just recently had a meeting with a social media influencer who came to the prison, was one of the only visitors he ever received. And during that meeting, this podcaster's name was brought up. So the FBI bring her in to try and figure out what she has to do with this guy, what she has to do with the social media influencer, how it's all connected. It's super convoluted, but it was so much fun to try and piece it all together and figure out what was going on. It was honestly one of the few thrillers I've read recently where I had no idea what was happening for the longest time. Like, no idea. Because of that, it was one of the better thrillers that I've read recently, and I gave it 4 stars. Oh my god, we're almost done, I think. Next up, we have 0 Days by Ruth Ware. This is her newest thriller. I gave this 4 stars as well. It was super fun. It was super different than a lot of her books, but I enjoyed it. It follows this couple. The husband gets murdered and the wife ends up accused of that murder, and she goes on the run to try and solve it and figure out what happened. It was super fun. It was super different. It was super unique for Ruth Ware. I gave it 4 stars. If you want more of my thoughts on this, it is in that Wrapped TBR 24-hour reading blog. Next, we have The 5-Star Weekend by Ellen Hildebrand. This is Ellen Hildebrand's most recent book. I was super hesitant to go into this, but I ended up having a great time. Her writing is so easily digestible and so much fun that I couldn't put it down, and I read this in the 24-hour readathon as well. So all of my thoughts are going to be in that vlog, but I gave this a 4-star. I had a great time, and it's definitely making me more optimistic about picking up her books in the future. Then we have The Soulmate. This was also in that 24-hour vlog. I ended up giving this 4.5 stars. This honestly surprised me in the best way. I was not expecting to love this. I honestly wasn't even expecting to like it that much. I thought it was going to be very average for me, and I ended up having so much fun with this. The perspectives were so interesting. The timelines were so interesting. It jumped around so much. It moved so fast. It was so fast paced. I had so much fun. It was like this close to being a 5-star, honestly. Like the more I think about it, the more I'm like, was this a 5-star? I don't know. It was super close. I really, really had fun with this. Then we have Golden Sun by Pierce Brown. This is the second book in the Red Rising trilogy. I am embarrassed to say that I have tried to read this book so many times over the last couple of years. I would get like a little bit into it, maybe a quarter or halfway through it, and then I would get distracted by something else, or I would get bored, or I would get confused, and I would put it down. And every time I pick it up again, I have to start all over because it is a pretty complex political sci-fi, so you really kind of do have to pay attention, and there's a ton of characters. I kept having to reread the same thing over and over again, but I finally forced myself to get through the entire thing this month. I was literally this close to putting it down again with like 150 pages left. And thank God I stayed strong and I pushed through it. I'm so embarrassed by that because I really do love Pierce Brown's writing, and this story is so interesting. I don't know why I had such trouble with this. So many people say this is their favorite in the original trilogy, and yet, I don't know, I couldn't get through it for the longest time. But I finally did, and of course it was a 4.5 star. It was this close to being a 5-star. Red Rising was definitely a 5-star for me. And I think this series overall is probably a 5-star. But because this took so long for me to get through, I can't give it a 5-star in good conscience. But I loved it. And the ending, oh my God. Like, I need to know what happens next. I put Morningstar on my September TBR because I have to keep going. I have to keep the momentum going. And I'm hoping that I can get through this entire series, or at least all the current books that are out, by the end of the year. So I finally feel like I'm making some progress with this, and I'm very excited about it. And the last book in this wrap-up, and my favorite book of August, The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. This was my only 5-star of August. This is a young adult mystery. It's the first in a series. And honestly, was this the best book I've ever read? No. But it was the most fun book I read in August. 1000%. I had such a good time reading this. I cannot wait to finish the series. And because of that, I had that 5-star feeling, and I had to go with it. No one's as surprised as me that a young adult book is getting a 5-star, but it was just so much fun. That's all I can say about it. It was so much fun. I loved it. Whew. That is everything. That is all 25 books I read over the last 2 months. Hopefully I didn't bore you to tears, because I kind of bored myself to tears, but I need to figure out how I'm going to do wrap-ups, because honestly, I kind of find wrap-ups a little bit boring, so let me know what you guys think, if you enjoy wrap-ups. I don't know if I should do like quarterly or monthly or just skip them all together. I feel like, especially if half of these books I've been reading in vlogs, do we really need to discuss it again? But at the same time, it's like basic booktube format to do a TBR and a wrap-up every month. That's like the bare minimum to be a booktuber. So for now, I'm following that template, but we may be adjusting that in the future. We'll see. But if you're somehow still with me and you weren't bored to tears, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in another video very soon. Hopefully. Bye.